Okay, this is the supplementary lecture, video lecture for Urban Sociology, West Virginia State University. This may be in a couple parts, maybe even 3 parts, but we'll see how the time goes with this. Chapter 7, which is what I assigned for reading in your textbook, is going to start to deal a little bit with something that's called social stratification. And I want to talk a little bit specifically about what social stratification is. If you've had an intro to sociology, you may recall talking about social stratification. Essentially, social stratification is structured inequality. So you'll want to write that down. You don't have a shell for this, so you'll want to take some pretty good notes on this stuff right here. So if I may, try to get this set up for you here so you can see this. Let's see if we can do this here. So social stratification essentially is structured inequality. That's what that means. And there are lots of different examples of social stratification that we could talk about. We could talk about gender, for example. We've never had a female president in the history of the United States. Now that could change, and hopefully it will in your lifetime. But that's an example of structured inequality. Our country, our society is set up in a way that males are offered privilege. They're afforded more status. It's more difficult for women and minorities to hold positions of power within our country. More difficult than it is for Caucasians, and we could talk about why that is the case. And we'll kind of do that as we go through the class. But back to this. Now, a couple of different examples of how we are stratified other than gender. We could start with income. Income is earnings from work investments. In 2008, the U.S. median family income was $61,521. Wealth refers to the total value of your money and your other assets, of course, minus your outstanding debts. So income is basically what you're bringing in, and wealth is what your stuff is worth, if you kind of want to think about it that way. If you want an example of a huge disparity in this country, we could look at the next statistic. In the United States, 1% of the population possesses approximately 35% of the nation's private resources. So a very small proportion of our population possesses a huge amount of the nation's wealth. Now we could argue, pay no attention to the page number, that doesn't mean anything for you guys, sorry. But we could debate whether that is a problem or not. Some people would say, yeah, this is a big problem. Too few people own too much stuff. Others would argue that this is not really a problem at all. But this is how our country is set up. You can aspire to the top rungs of the ladder in this country, and you could be in that 1% if you just worked hard enough. So there are arguments on both sides of that. Now, some examples of income range from business wages to rent. If you own property, you can rent it out, make money that way. Investments, royalties. I know some of you are aspiring to careers in music. Maybe you're going to be a rapper or a musician, or an actor or an actress. Anytime your music or your television programs or whatever, your movies get played, you get a little bit of a check, or maybe a big check for that. So that would be an example of a royalty or royalties. Interest, any interest that you make off investments. Alimony, for those of you aspiring to get married and then divorce and then take your significant other for everything that they have. Just kidding, kinda. That would be an example of alimony. Allowances when you were a kid. Maybe you got an allowance for working around the house. Gambling. Any income that you make from gambling. You're supposed to report that on your taxes, by the way, but that would also count as income. Now, some examples of wealth would be things like buildings, land, animals, machinery, cars, artwork, etc. Anything that is worth something. So those are examples of wealth. Now again, pay no attention to the page numbers here. We're going to start talking about social prestige. Social prestige simply refers to importance or respect. We tend to assign higher levels of social prestige to some people and lower levels of social prestige to other people or other groups of people. And one way that we can look at this, we certainly do it in terms of race and ethnicity. We tend to assign higher levels of prestige to white people. We have historically in this country, and we still tend to do that today as a country. Certainly, we could look at it in terms of employment and jobs. White-collar jobs, doctors, lawyers, management. We tend to think those jobs are more important in our country than blue-collar jobs. And blue-collar jobs essentially are jobs where you're working, maybe a uniform with your name on it. White-collar implies you're wearing a dress shirt, okay? Blue-collar implies that you're working, with a uniform. So blue-collar jobs might be coal mining jobs, auto mechanics, janitors. Nothing wrong with people who work blue-collar jobs. They tend to bring lower prestige and also lower salaries. We also tend to pay people in accordance with the prestige that we assign. So we make the argument that it's more important in our society to be a doctor or a lawyer. It's less important to be a janitor or an auto mechanic. And the pay goes accordingly, which is probably unfortunate in some ways. I mean, you can make the argument that doctors hold your life. A doctor could hold your life in his or her hands. So it's very important work. A surgeon should make a lot of money because he or she is doing some pretty important work. I could also make the argument that an auto mechanic has your life in his or her hands. If you have an incompetent auto mechanic who doesn't recognize and fix a problem with your car, you could die in your car. There could be a big problem when you hit the road with that car. So then you could have an accident. Something could happen because that problem wasn't fixed. But we have a tendency to kind of assign status in that way. Now sometimes, and we'll talk more specifically how this stuff applies to the city soon and in class, but I'm just kind of setting the stage with some terminology here. Sometimes we have what's called status inconsistency with certain occupations. And status inconsistency, this is something you'll want to have down as well. This happens when prestige and income are not positively correlated. In other words, status inconsistency occurs when you have a job that affords high status but low pay. Or maybe you have a job that affords low status but high pay. And you don't see that too often, but there are some examples of this exception to the rule, if you will. And I'll talk a little bit about those before we call this the end of part A here of this lecture. Example, I'm going to start with jobs that afford low status or low prestige but command higher incomes. Plumbers, for example. Most people, when I ask in class, what do you want to do? What do you want to be when you grow up? Very few people say that they want to be plumbers. Well, there's nothing wrong with being a plumber. Plumbers can make a lot of money. I remember a time I had a situation in my bathroom where the water was overflowing, and I wasn't smart enough to figure out how to fix it, so I needed a plumber ASAP. So I called someone who was close, came out. It was $120 just for him to show up, just to come and look at the problem. And then after he was there about an hour, he did fix the problem. It ended up costing me like $350. I mean, it was a pretty good day for this guy. He was only at my house for like an hour, hour and a half, tops. And I asked him, how much do you make in a year? Because I'm doing the math in my head thinking this is, we don't really think of plumbers as being a big deal or being something that you would want to aspire to be. And he was telling me he made about $150,000, $200,000 a year. I'm thinking, wow. So, I mean, again, he's making more money than some doctors and lawyers. We generally don't afford a lot of status or prestige to strippers. I had a student, a true story in my class when I first started teaching about 15 years ago, and she came up to me after class and mentioned that she was going to be gone. She was going to miss the next exam, and she was going to be gone for about a week and a half for work-related stuff. So I, explained to her that I would treat her the way I treat all students. There'd be a makeup exam; it would be a little more difficult, etc. And she mentioned to me and in front of the entire class that she was a stripper. of course, that got everybody's attention and put me in an awkward position. And I knew that she drove a nice car, and I knew that she would wear nice clothing. And I just, out of curiosity, I asked her, I'm like, how much, just out of curiosity, how much do you make, when you do that? And she said that she worked Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday day. She worked about 20 hours a week. And she would travel to different locations inside and outside of the state to do her job, so to say. And just doing that alone was making about $50,000 to $60,000 a year, just working those few hours on weekends doing that. Now, low status, people tended to not think much of her profession. Even in the class, the other students didn't think much of her when she said that she was a stripper. But she was making a lot of money doing it, a whole lot of money. So, another example, some of you I know work in restaurants. We've talked about that. I have done this as well. We tend to assign low levels of status to servers, to wait staff, to bartenders. But they can make a lot of money. We can think of people who make a lot of money in tips. I've talked about this in class before. There are some servers, some bartenders who will make, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 a year, depending on where they work. So now it can go the other way as well. Sometimes we afford we afford higher levels of status to people, but we pay them less. Ministers would be an example. Preachers. We tend to think of them as being, pillars of the community. We assign higher status, but their salaries are not commensurate with that status. Teachers would be another example. We tend to think more of teachers and assign them higher status. However, they tend not to make nearly as much money as one might think that they make. And we're going to skip through marks just for a second there. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about our class system. We live in what's called a social class system. We have the ability to kind of move up and down the social class ladder. Not every society is put together that way. And we could go back to Marx now for a second. Marx, if you remember, talked about the idea that there were, big gaps between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. And he was trying to think of ways to make, access to things, to products in society more even. He wasn't trying to make everything completely even. That's a misnomer. But he was trying to kind of close that gap, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit. Not every society, again, has a social class system. If you look at India, for example, they have what's called a caste system, where basically you're born into a certain social group or division, a caste, and you're basically stuck there. You can't get out of it. No matter how smart, how attractive, how manipulative you are, you're pretty much there. If you're born in the bottom class, the undesirable caste, rather, that's where you stay. If you're born into the upper caste, where there's more privilege and favor, then you get to enjoy everything that comes with that, regardless of your ability or income or whatever. So we'll go ahead and call that the end of this first part. Thanks.